Senator Angus King just cornered Secretary Hegseth in a tense committee exchange, demanding hard answers about a missing $400 million appropriation and a defense budget deliberately engineered to bypass standard congressional oversight. He pointedly asked what had become of the funds approved by a bipartisan, bicameral act of Congress the previous year. If you are a taxpayer in this nation, you need to look very closely at the mechanics of this specific hearing. From the unprecedented move of pulling 25% of the military budget entirely out of regular order to the deliberate stalling of legally approved funds, this is the exact accountability battle that the public absolutely needs to witness. Here is the unvarnished reality of that confrontation. The senator initiated the inquiry by focusing directly on the highly unusual manner in which the current budget had been constructed. He noted that throughout his entire tenure, up until the previous year, the committee had consistently relied upon bipartisan budgets and bipartisan National Defense Authorization Acts, all successfully passed by solid majorities. He emphasized his own historical support, having personally voted for every single one of those standard authorizations. Suddenly, in the current legislative year, a staggering 25% of the massive budget has been essentially extracted from the traditional deliberative process. This massive quarter of the funding is slated to be passed through a legislative maneuver known as reconciliation, a mechanism that is fundamentally and by definition a strictly partisan exercise. Senator King directly challenged the secretary, asking why these massive expenditures, including military housing and other major items, were completely excluded from the regular budgetary framework. He questioned the sudden emergence of a bifurcated two-part budget system where the committee and Congress maintain standard oversight over the majority, while a massive quarter of the funding operates essentially as an unscrutinized slush fund. In his response, the secretary politely acknowledged the inquiry, but explicitly rejected the characterization of the funds as a slush fund. Instead, he urged the committee to view the financial request in its absolute totality as a comprehensive $1.5 trillion defense budget. When pressed again on the necessity of separating the request into two distinct legislative pieces, the secretary offered a somewhat opaque explanation regarding multiple vehicle dynamics playing a role in the structural decision. He assured the room that the administration remained fully committed to working alongside the committee to guarantee that the appropriate legislative vehicles are utilized to achieve that precise $1.5 trillion target. The senator remained entirely unsatisfied, bluntly stating that his fundamental question had been completely dodged. He reiterated his demand to know exactly why the budget was split into two pieces, emphasizing that for time immemorial, congressional budgets had followed a standard procedure. To his extensive knowledge, the reconciliation process had absolutely never been deployed to authorize a foundational defense budget in this manner. He forcefully asked what was truly happening behind the scenes and why the traditional route was abandoned. The secretary maintained his defensive posture, repeating that his understanding of the dual vehicle strategy was simply to ensure the department actually secures the $1.5 trillion. He continuously framed that massive top-line number as the most critical bottom line necessary to fund national security requirements, arguing that the partisan reconciliation process was deemed the most effective method to reach that ultimate financial destination. The senator immediately translated that bureaucratic response, suggesting the administration's true motivation was a simple desire to avoid dealing with a pesky Congress and its constitutionally mandated appropriation process. Addressing the committee chairman, he declared it deeply significant and highly troubling that the legislative branch was essentially abdicating a full quarter of its constitutional oversight responsibility regarding the military budget. A staggering defense budget yanked away from regular legislative order, forcefully routed through a highly partisan process, and a massive 25% of total military spending deliberately shielded from standard congressional oversight. That sequence of events alone made this specific hearing critically important, but the senator was only just beginning his rigorous interrogation. If you genuinely believe the American public deserves absolute transparency regarding these astronomical defense expenditures, please take a brief second to subscribe and hit the like button on this video right now. He smoothly shifted the intense focus away from the procedural budget structure and toward an issue of significantly greater geopolitical gravity, specifically the entirely zeroed-out funding and the mysteriously missing $400 million. He pivoted the conversation by highlighting a crucial factor buried within the new budget that had received absolutely zero public attention: the complete elimination of all funding designated for Ukraine. He sought immediate confirmation, asking the official if it was indeed accurate that the current proposal contained absolutely zero Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative funding. The official confirmed the stark reality plainly, stating there is absolutely no USAI funding present in the current budget request. The senator then raised the critical issue of the $400 million that had been formally appropriated the previous year through a legally binding bipartisan bicameral act of Congress. He demanded to know exactly what had happened to that massive sum of taxpayer money. The official's response revealed a startling reality, acknowledging his understanding that not a single dollar of that mandated appropriation had actually been dispersed to the intended recipients. He attempted to mitigate the revelation by claiming the funds had been released internally very recently, noting that the department originally received the financial authority back in March. He offered a standard bureaucratic defense, stating it simply takes a considerable amount of time for complex funding to mechanically flow through the massive Defense Department apparatus. However, he promised the committee that the money was going to be put to work very shortly, emphasizing ongoing coordination with the European Command to ensure the delayed funds are eventually utilized in the most appropriate manner possible. Unwilling to let a colleague be the only committee member utilizing visual aids, the senator produced a highly revealing exhibit demonstrating the exact trajectory of international support for Ukraine over several years. He explained the visual data, noting that the orange bars represented the financial support provided by the United States, while the blue bars represented the contributions from European allies. The chart starkly illustrated that by the projected year of 2026, Europe would be shouldering a staggering 99% of the total burden. He noted that the exact same heavily skewed ratio applied to the distribution of humanitarian assistance and other vital aid flowing into the war-torn nation. He passionately framed the conflict not as a distant territorial dispute, but as an absolute existential struggle, determining the future survival of global democracy. He reminded the room that the crisis was initiated when an aggressively hostile nation violently invaded a peaceful neighboring country without a shred of valid justification. Furthermore, he added a crucial economic context, noting that the invading Russian forces are simultaneously emerging as the primary geopolitical winners resulting from the separate ongoing conflict in Iran. He cited credible estimates indicating the aggressor nation had already secured between $40 and $80 billion in massive additional revenues, profiting immensely from surging global oil prices and the strategic relief of international sanctions directly tied to the Iranian situation. With that profound strategic context established, he directly asked Secretary Hegseth why the United States was actively choosing to abandon Ukraine. The secretary did not retreat from the confrontation. Instead, he embraced the premise of the visual exhibit. He asked the senator to hold the chart back up for the room to see, boldly declaring it to be a genuinely beautiful chart. He argued that the heavily skewed data represented exactly the strategic outcome the administration actively desired. He forcefully stated that the United States absolutely wants the European continent to step up, fully fund the defense initiatives, and shoulder the vast majority of the heavy geopolitical burden. He categorized the European nations as incredibly wealthy countries, collectively boasting an immense $20 trillion economy that vastly overshadows the adversary's roughly $2 trillion economic output. Because of this massive financial disparity, he insisted that Europe is more than capable of stepping up and fully funding the resistance. He claimed they were already doing exactly that through mechanisms like the Pearl Initiative and coordination with the European Command. He framed this strategic withdrawal as precisely what the American voting public desires to see: wealthy allied nations stepping up and funding their own regional security. He concluded his point by stating that if stopping the Russian incursion and supporting the immense bravery of the Ukrainian forces is truly that critical to the European continent, which he acknowledged it certainly is, then those specific European countries should be the ones paying the bill. He argued the presented chart proved this transition was occurring, and he confirmed it stands as the official policy of the current administration. The senator challenged this aggressively isolationist framing immediately, asking if the secretary was officially stating that the United States possesses absolutely zero national interest in the ultimate outcome of the conflict in Ukraine. He asked if the administration truly believed the crisis was a burden meant exclusively for the Europeans to bear alone. The secretary clarified his position, stating that the kinetic military threat is geographically located far closer to the incredibly rich and capable nations of Europe, and therefore, those specific nations must step up to lead the strategic charge. He reiterated that the visual proof of their increased financial burden was a highly positive development. While acknowledging that the European allies had indeed increased their contributions, the senator issued a grim warning regarding the domestic perception of this policy shift. He stated that the American people need to clearly understand that their government has deliberately stepped back from its historical leadership role. He went further, characterizing the retreat as stepping back to the absolute point of total abandonment. The secretary quickly countered with a political defense, asserting that this devastating war would never have occurred in the first place under the leadership of President Trump. He added that the current president actively supports ending the brutal conflict through a negotiated diplomatic deal and has actively pursued that specific resolution, although he admitted that a successful deal has not yet materialized. As his allotted time expired, the senator indicated a desire to discuss the designation of transnational criminal organizations, but the structural revelations of the hearing had already taken center stage. Here is the massive institutional loophole that this confrontation brilliantly exposed to the public. Under standard operating procedures, every single major defense expenditure is legally required to navigate a highly strict, multi-layered oversight process. The United States Congress formally authorizes the initial funding, and the Senate committee rigorously oversees its eventual execution. Both of these structural steps exist for an incredibly vital constitutional reason. The system is explicitly designed so that no single branch of the federal government ever possesses the unchecked authority to completely control the massive military budget operating in the dark. However, this hearing revealed a highly effective method to completely bypass that mandated legislative scrutiny. The strategy involves forcefully moving 25% of the newly requested budget into an inherently partisan legislative track, while simultaneously refusing to distribute the specific funds that Congress had already legally passed in previous sessions. The Department of Defense formally receives the allocated money, but absolutely nobody acts on the directive to spend it. Therefore, if an administration secretly desires to completely cut off vital military support to a besieged international ally, but desperately wants to avoid a highly public and controversial floor vote in Congress, they can simply freeze the $400 million in place and conveniently blame the delay on bureaucratic paperwork. That deceptive maneuver is exactly what is transpiring in reality right now. Now, here is the deeply alarming part of the strategy that absolutely nobody in Washington is willing to name out loud. A massive federal department that intentionally sits on hundreds of millions of legally mandated taxpayer dollars is absolutely not experiencing a simple, innocent administrative delay. They are aggressively executing an entirely new foreign policy directive without ever asking the legislative branch for permission. To fully comprehend exactly why this administrative circumvention matters so deeply, it immensely helps to understand what the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative actually represents in practice. The USAI is absolutely not a humanitarian charity program. It was meticulously created by the United States Congress for the highly specific purpose of physically training and heavily equipping Ukrainian armed forces. The core objective was to methodically build the long-term, sustainable military capacity of a sovereign country that has been actively defending its recognized borders against a hostile major global power since the initial escalation in 2022. The vital funds that continuously flow through the USAI pipeline are formal congressional appropriations. This designation means the money successfully survived the grueling, full legislative process, exhaustive committee review, intense floor debate, a successful bicameral vote in both chambers, and a final, binding presidential signature. The specific $400 million that Senator King relentlessly referenced was absolutely not a flexible presidential discretionary fund. It was the codified law of the land. And yet, despite that legal reality, the official plainly confirmed a staggering fact. There is absolutely zero USAI funding included in the current budget proposal. The funding was not slightly reduced, and it was not cleverly reallocated to other departments. It was reduced to absolute zero. When the senator heavily pressed him regarding the abandoned $400 million from the previous year's legal appropriation, the official simply acknowledged that the massive funds had been released internally only recently. He offered the tired excuse that it inherently takes time for that volume of money to systematically flow through the labyrinthine department. While that carefully constructed answer was technically true, it is precisely the kind of evasive response that instantly raises the exact constitutional question it desperately attempted to resolve. The United States Congress formally passed that specific appropriation. The massive sum of money deliberately sat completely untouched, and now the executive administration is audaciously telling a Senate Oversight Committee that the funds will supposedly be put to work very shortly, offering absolutely no concrete timeline and providing zero specific details regarding how the deployment will occur. What the senator from Maine was brilliantly pointing at extends far beyond the immediate geopolitical survival of Ukraine. It strikes directly at the absolute foundational core of what the congressional spending power actually means when exercised in practical reality. Article 1 of the United States Constitution explicitly grants Congress the exclusive power of the purse. That vital authority is absolutely not a minor procedural formality. It stands as the absolute primary, most powerful structural check the legislative branch holds over the ambitions of the executive branch. When the Congress legally appropriates taxpayer money for a highly specific, defined purpose, and that specific money deliberately does not move, or miraculously moves only after intense public pressure is applied during a televised hearing, the resulting constitutional crisis is absolutely not subtle. This exact fundamental issue perfectly applies to the senator's earlier aggressive questions regarding the unprecedented structure of the broader defense budget. He was absolutely not simply raising a minor procedural objection to the esoteric use of reconciliation as a legislative vehicle. He was actively constructing a significantly larger, far more devastating argument. He recognized that intentionally routing a full quarter of the entire national defense budget through a strictly partisan reconciliation process deliberately and maliciously avoids the rigorous bipartisan committee oversight that has successfully governed American military spending for countless decades. The Senate Armed Services Committee exists for the explicit primary purpose of meticulously scrutinizing exactly these types of massive financial decisions. Deliberately bypassing this entrenched system is not a minor parliamentary technicality. It represents a massive, fundamental structural change in exactly how American defense dollars are controlled and monitored. The Secretary's repetitive response to that highly damaging line of questioning was to continuously retreat to the massive $1.5 trillion total figure. He repeatedly insisted that hitting the financial target was the most important bottom line, saying it multiple times to deflect the procedural critique. However, the senator was absolutely not asking about the final total. He was aggressively demanding answers about the democratic process itself. And that specific distinction matters immensely to the Republic because the deliberative process is the exact location where actual accountability lives and breathes. A massive financial number stripped entirely of legislative oversight is fundamentally not a budget. It is merely an unprecedented transfer of raw power. Now it is vital to pull the analytical camera back even further to view the broader implications. The ongoing geopolitical crisis raging in Eastern Europe possesses incredibly deep, complex strategic roots. The nation of Ukraine had been serving as a primary target of relentless Russian pressure since at least the year 2014. Perfectly aligning with the aggressive annexation of Crimea and the initiation of brutal fighting in the Donbas region. The massive military escalation that occurred in 2022 fundamentally and violently shifted the established geopolitical stability of the entire European continent, triggering a massive, unprecedented regional crisis. This violence forcefully demanded a fundamental, ground-up rethinking of the comprehensive European security architecture that the NATO alliance had been slowly and carefully constructing ever since the Cold War officially ended. The senator made a profoundly brilliant point that desperately deserves significantly more attention than it actually received within the confines of that hearing room. He astutely noted that the Russian state has surprisingly emerged as one of the primary, massive beneficiaries of the separate ongoing geopolitical conflict located in Iran. The staggering financial estimates he cited on the record, detailing $40 to $80 billion in massive additional oil revenues, coupled with the strategic relief of international sanctions, are entirely consistent with the data that global energy analysts have meticulously tracked ever since Western diplomatic focus heavily shifted toward stabilizing the Persian Gulf. The reality is that Russia is absolutely not a passive, isolated actor in any of these global events. The nation maintains massive, deeply entrenched strategic interests in both explosive theaters and possesses the immense financial means required to aggressively pursue them. Drastically reducing direct American engagement on the global stage directly and immediately benefits these other ambitious geopolitical players. The Secretary's primary counterargument to this reality rested heavily on two distinct, highly controversial claims. The first assertion was that the European continent is incredibly wealthy and highly capable, and therefore must bear the absolute primary financial burden, especially since the violent threat is physically located directly on their territorial doorstep. The second aggressive claim was that this devastating conflict would absolutely never have occurred under the previous leadership of President Trump, and that the current president is actively and successfully pursuing a negotiated deal to finally end the bloodshed. Both of those massive political points desperately deserve to be examined directly and rigorously, rather than simply being dismissed out of hand. Regarding the first massive claim, the European continent has undeniably and dramatically increased its financial and military support. The senator's own visual chart perfectly confirmed that European financial contributions dedicated to Ukraine's defense and vital humanitarian needs have risen incredibly sharply since the initial escalation in 2022. However, the political argument insisting that Europe's mere geographic proximity to the violent threat somehow fully justifies a complete, total American withdrawal fundamentally misreads exactly how international military alliances are designed to function. The NATO alliance is absolutely not a localized neighborhood watch program where only the closest residents are expected to take defensive responsibility. It is a massive, highly complex collective security arrangement, explicitly built upon the foundational premise that a violent threat directed at one single member is universally considered a direct threat to all participating members. The United States famously served as the primary foundational architect of that entire global arrangement. Casually walking away from that historic commitment does not solely affect the immediate survival of Ukraine. It instantly broadcasts a chilling message to every single treaty partner across the globe regarding exactly what American diplomatic commitments are truly worth in a crisis. On the second major political point, regardless of highly debated past diplomatic claims or hypothetical alternate histories, the brutal current reality remains exactly the same. What is absolutely knowable and undeniable is that the violent conflict is actively ongoing right now, and the intense bloodshed has been heavily sustained for a period extending well beyond 3 excruciating years. Whatever the complex diplomatic history may be, the Ukrainian soldiers actively fighting and dying on the ground are forcefully dealing with brutal present facts, absolutely not hypothetical political timelines. And those inescapable present facts currently include a massive American defense budget that deliberately allocates exactly $0 to ensure their continued territorial defense. There was a highly revealing moment buried within that tense exchange that simply did not receive enough public attention. The senator asked the secretary directly if the administration possesses absolutely zero interest in what ultimately happens to Ukraine. The secretary notably did not claim that aggressive framing was factually wrong. Instead, he reiterated that the violent threat is geographically closer to Europe and demanded they should lead the response. That response is an entirely different kind of answer. It absolutely does not deny that the United States is actively stepping back from the world stage. It simply attempts to firmly justify the step back. That highly controversial justification, offered proudly and publicly by the sitting Secretary of Defense in front of the powerful Senate Armed Services Committee, is now permanently etched onto the official historical record. What the senator stated in his closing remarks was incredibly deliberate and deeply calculated. He acknowledged the allies have stepped up, but insisted the American people must clearly understand that the United States has stepped back. He intentionally did not say the administration's policy was morally wrong, according to his personal values. He forcefully stated that the American public fundamentally deserves to understand exactly what is happening in reality. That represents an entirely different kind of political statement. It is a foundational argument demanding absolute transparency, highlighting the massive, dangerous chasm between what the voting public is being actively told and what the Oversight Committee is actually seeing buried within the financial numbers. The experienced individuals in that room who have watched this specific budget process most closely understand a terrifying reality that did not fully translate through the televised exchange. The strategic use of defense reconciliation, the exact legislative vehicle the Secretary aggressively defended for routing a massive 25% of all military spending entirely outside the normal scrutinized appropriations process, has absolutely never been utilized at this staggering scale before in modern history. The historic Budget Act of 1974 intentionally created the reconciliation process as a highly specific tool meant for deficit reduction. Absolutely not, as a backdoor mechanism designed for secretly funding massive defense procurement programs and expansive military housing projects. Utilizing the tool in this unprecedented manner is technically not illegal, but it is genuinely and undeniably without any modern historical precedent. Furthermore, it dangerously concentrates massive spending decisions in a highly secretive way that completely sidelines the robust committee oversight structure that Congress painstakingly built over several generations specifically to prevent that kind of dangerous financial concentration. The senator from Maine has proudly served in the chamber since the year 2013. He operates as a fierce independent who has traditionally caucused with Democrats. Yet he has painstakingly built a rock-solid reputation for successfully working across bitter party lines to secure vital defense and intelligence initiatives. He has historically voted for every single bipartisan defense budget that has ever been placed before him. His visible frustration during this explosive hearing was absolutely not a calculated display of partisan performance art. It was a deeply genuine institutional terror. He was sitting there watching a rigorous democratic process he has actively participated in for more than a dedicated decade, being completely and ruthlessly restructured all around him without a shred of valid explanation. The massive constitutional question he raised regarding the survival of Ukraine remains an incredibly active, unresolved structural issue. The $400 million stubbornly sits untouched. The newly proposed budget deliberately allocates absolutely nothing more to the cause. The European continent currently carries 99% of the massive financial burden, and the sitting Secretary of Defense, when explicitly shown a physical chart depicting that exact staggering reality, looked at it and publicly declared it was beautiful. That highly controversial statement is now permanently locked onto the official record. Senator King arrived armed with the exact devastating numbers, but Secretary Hegseth stood rigidly firm defending the radical new policy. This entire confrontation isn't simply about a single isolated defense budget. It is a massive battle over who really controls exactly how your hard-earned tax dollars are spent in the dark. What is your ultimate take on the Secretary's aggressive response? Drop your detailed opinion down in the comments. I personally read every single one of them. If you truly value this kind of direct, uncompromising, record-based political analysis, make absolutely sure to immediately like the video and subscribe to the channel. I will see you in the very next detailed breakdown.